across the 13th century, those streets that had led out from the city of Florence had become important corridors that sometimes connected to cities that the Florentines were either rivals with, like Prato, or allies with, and in some cases like Prato, that they had begun to incorporate into the Florentine orbit out to the north, this way here out to the east, and of course the Via Roma to the south. But lots of other streets had grown up as well. This one, the Via dei Servi, connected out to the Servites, who were another religious order started in Florence, who had property to the north beyond Fiesole, over the hills to the north of the city of Florence, and so there was an important street that led out that way. And what you can also see in the pattern of streets is that those major corridors out of the city also developed subsidiary streets or secondary streets that were related to them in some way or another. And so there were whole neighborhoods that had grown up around those street networks. And those preaching orders had really, transformed the sense of the scale of the city. They were, again, outside that last medieval circuit of walls, and they developed their own neighborhoods, and so there was a lot of urban fabric outside of that 12th century circuit of walls. The Florentines needed to do some serious thinking. And one of the things they also wanted to confront was this idea that when a city like Florence was attacked, the attacking army would typically burn the fields around the city that provided food to the city so that the city would be starved. And so they decided to build a circuit of walls at the end of the 13th century that wouldn't just incorporate the urban fabric as it was, but would actually incorporate large amounts of open fields that could be used to provide sustenance for the city within the city walls if the city was under attack. And again, we can see that last circuit of walls that remained in the essentially pattern of streets, because they were demolished, like a lot of cities demolished medieval walls in the 19th century. Paris did the same thing, and they replaced those walls by boulevards. And so the large boulevard that wraps the center of Florence really represents the presence of the old Roman, or the old Florentine 13th century and 14th century circuit of walls. So here it is. We can trace it. Well, let's start down here at the Porta Romana. We follow the Viale up, crosses the Arno here, moves this way, arrives at this, which is actually a later addition, but I want to show it and incorporate it into this discussion. This is the Fortezza da Basso, built by the Medici in the early 16th century, but essentially appended onto the medieval circuit of walls. Walls go up this way. There would have been a gate here, another gate here. They come down. A gate would have happened here. And then essentially they would have moved more or less towards the Arno River. Now on the south side of town, in the Oltrarno, or above the Oltrarno, that area across the Arno, this time they actually sent the walls up the hills. And this is actually one of the last remaining circuits of the Florentine mural circuit, the wall circuit. It exists up here and was not in fact replaced by a boulevard because it was essentially riding the crest of a hill. There was another fort built here, again by the Medici, after the lower fort, this one, the Fortezza Belvedere, up at that high point, the Belvedere, a beautiful place for a view. Here the walls keep going, they come down, they descend down towards the Arno, and would have again essentially arrived and had another gate outpost here on the south bank of the Arno River. And so the reality is we can see that pattern. I mean, I traced it here on the plan, but if you imagine looking at the plan again, we can actually see how it shows us this information. If we know a little bit about how cities grow and we use a little bit of imagination, we can read the history of the city in a plan without even knowing very much about how the city had changed. We can actually see that history in the evidence of the urban fabric. And that's why this is an important skill. It might be a useful skill for you if you want to go visit a city you've never been to before and learn a little something or imagine something about its history. But it also helps us understand essentially what cities did to essentially define themselves over time, how they understood their priorities, what their sense was of growth, what their sense of their future was, and to what extent they tended to preserve or keep intact some of that evidence of their past. And in Florence, we see all those things in operation.